Um, Hello, everybody. Welcome to today lecture. So today is a seminar speaker in our ETM Distinguished Speaker Series. It is a cross-listed item with a graduate seminar series at PSU here as well. So there are some people that are taking this for credit, as well as many people from the community that are joining us by way of our meetup group. And so just for curiosity first, if we could have a show of hands of who heard about it through meetup or an associated thing. How about through IEEE? I mean, it's also cross-listed with IEEE's Technology and Engineering Management section, Oregon chapter, of which Dr. Turl Daim in the back is a leader in that group, as well as the editor-in-chief of the premier journal in that area. So my name is Tim Anderson. I'm the chair of the Engineering and Technology Management Department. We all welcome you here today. After today's talk, we are going to have an informal little reception back in the ETM department. You're welcome to use that time as well to meet and talk both with the speaker, members of the ETM community, et cetera, and follow up on discussion. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Antonie Jetter. She's been very active in helping engage with our Smart Cities initiative here at PSU. She's a faculty member in the ETM department and is the Wedge Vision Professor for the College of Engineering, one of two right now. And has been a faculty member in our department for over a dozen years now, I think.
Yes.
So, and so I don't want to take any more time away, but please join me in welcoming Dr. Jetter.
So I should start with a disclaimer. My talk, A Tale of Smart Cities, the Best and Worst of Times, is not a traditional research talk. It's really more, I'm a little bit on a soapbox here. It's a little bit more my collection of thoughts about smart cities. And this has evolved over the past several years. I'm on the planning team and the advisory council for PSU's Digital Cities Testbed Center, which leads to a lot of conversations about where technology is going. My research area is in product development and in understanding so-called wicked problems through system modeling. And I can't think of anything more wicked than getting a city right. And so through all these many conversations, I've started to discover a few things in smart cities that I think need to be talked about. And my attempt today is to get the conversation going. For the next academic quarter, we are planning to have a series of speakers who all cover different aspects of smart cities, Internet of Things technologies, and these will be real academic research presentations. Mine today is here to more or less set the stage. And when we talk about smart cities, we should probably talk about what we mean by that. And this is a combination of definitions that exist in the literature, that exist also in industry, and this is pretty much the most ambitious combination because it takes all elements from all definitions. And so it means that smart cities use information and communication technology for data collection, data analysis, and data-based decision-making to identify and anticipate citizen problems, and then to provide services in response to those problems. And services can be water and transportation and can be health. In order to manage growth in cities while improving quality of life, efficiency, environmental sustainability, and resilience. So all of this is usually associated with this notion of smart cities. And the concept is pretty old. So already 30 years ago, people talked about smart cities, and we probably are, to some extent, wondering when will they really become as smart as we all envision. And before we talk about smart cities, we might want to look into dumb cities. So these are solutions in dumb cities. And when you look at those solutions and the problems they are solving, then what becomes quite apparent is that the problems and the solutions over many centuries are actually not too different from what we are discussing today. So on the left-hand side, this is a picture taken in 1916 in London. This is a suffragette who was busy fighting for women's rights to vote, and she was using an electric scooter that her husband built for her. But the husband actually commercialized this. So there was more than one scooter in London in 1916. And when you look at the actual design, it doesn't look so different from what's out in Portland right now and is hailed as smart cities, cool new ways of transportation. The picture on top is a Roman horse-drawn wagon. And in over 2,000 years ago, Rome had a massive problem. They had traffic congestion and horrible traffic congestion. And so they came up with a solution that London is using today. They basically said, okay, if you're delivering freight, or if you want to use one of those fancy, pricey, horse-drawn carriages, you do this after dusk until dawn. And the rest of the day, Roman streets are for people walking and for really small wagons. So they basically rationed transportation. And this is a law under Julius Caesar. And a whole bunch of other transportation laws followed. So all of this, I think, resonates with us today and speaks to the fact that the problems we are trying to solve in smart cities have probably been around for a very, very long time. So what is different in smart cities? What is really and truly different is that we are trying to solve these problems through data and connected technologies. And what such a problem solution could look like, I'd like to demonstrate by introducing you to Susan. So Susan is 76 years old, retired. She lives in a city after having lived in the suburbs for most of her life. And when she moved into the city, she did this with this idea, okay, I'm closer to my daughter's home. I also am closer to many services, including public transportation. And she leveraged a city program to give up her personal car. So she does not have a private car anymore, even though she's able to drive. And instead, she mainly uses public transportation, but the city, in return for her giving up her car and saving parking spaces, also gave her a bunch of ride-sharing vouchers that she can pull when she needs to do that. So she lives on her own, close to her daughter's family, and right now she's considering a hip replacement because she has continuous pain in one hip. So that's her. How would she interact with a smart city? Let's say her daughter calls her and says, I'm working late and I have to take out business guests to dinner. Can you pick up the kids at daycare? And Susan wants to do this. And so in a smart city, the vision is she will just talk into her phone, no typing needed. And she will ask, well, what is a good bus connection? And the phone will tell her, actually, the usual bus stop is closed and it has moved up the street a little bit. And that would require you to use a pedestrian staircase, which is probably not a good idea with her hip. So she decides, okay, no bus today for me. I'm getting a ride-hailing service, which she calls through her phone, automatically pulling the voucher she got from the city and ordering 2 car seats for her grandchildren. So that's the notion. All the elements are there already. The idea is that we provide this seamless integration to then help people really deal with everyday life much more efficiently and effectively. So not entirely science fiction. Nothing in that little scenario doesn't exist in some way or form already. It's all about connectivity. It's all about integration. How do we envision that this happens? So fundamentally, in a smart city, the idea is that things, cell phones, cars, thermostats, garbage cans, lampposts, whatever, collect data. And this data is then uploaded to the cloud, has the advantage that you can very cheaply store large amounts of data and you can adjust capacity as you need it. And this cloud-based data might be owned by the city, might be owned by private companies, and some of the city-owned and even the privately owned data can be opened up for other people to use. And so there are quite a few open data initiatives in cities today to make this data available. So this raw data is stored, and then we need some kind of way to select and organize it. And once it is pre-processed, selected, and organized, we can use it to answer questions. And the type of questions we are descriptive, diagnostic, predictive, and prescriptive. I'll talk a little bit more about this. But most of those questions still lead to decision makers actually coming up with answers. So the data is there so that decision makers are supported in their decision making, coming up with answers, and then they take action. They somehow change the city, which produces new data. And some of the actions are actually automatically taken by a software algorithm. So it's fully automated. Again, changes to the city leading to new data. And the idea is that this produces this continuous cycle of learning and improving that leads to all those wonderful outcomes that I talked about. So what types of data analysis do we need for this? Because this is core to the smart city, data and data analysis. So one level of data analysis is really what is happening. It's really descriptive. And these would be simple questions like how many street lights are on, or where in Portland is air pollution high? And I call that show and tell. You still need a human to make sense of this, but you have data now that you didn't have before. Another layer of data analysis is diagnostic. So it really asks the question, why is this happening? And these would be questions like, do people avoid the park because there's so much traffic on the road before that crossing it safely is an issue? Or is air pollution caused by businesses or traffic? And the way to analyze these things is simply statistics as we know it. So it's a lot of correlation. So we will look at density and traffic and pollution and correlate and test hypotheses. So that's one type of data analysis that's happening. A third one is predictive. And this is, of course, much more complex. That's why I say it's a little bit like climate models. Many factors impacting something, many factors used for prediction. And these would be things like which parks will see the least use, or how many people will take the bus next month. And then finally, what everybody seems very excited about right now is kind of prescriptive analysis, which is the world of autonomous everything. And that's where kind of data science and artificial intelligence are merging. And these are ideas like, okay, what if the garbage truck was dispatched automatically on an ideal route based on what the sensor in the trash can tells us how full they are? So no human with a general traffic route, but we are doing this on demand, and we're not running an analysis and have a human dispatch, but we actually have autonomous technology dispatch. And the same you could imagine, of course, is to dispatch police because of aggressive conversations in the park. We have all the bits and pieces. We can do sentiment analysis and know if a conversation is aggressive or not. We could link this to the dispatch system. And if this sounds horrible to you, there are many US cities who already have a system in place that detects gunshots and uses the gunshot detection to automatically dispatch police in the area where the gunshot has originated. So this is not that far out. This is quite conceivable that people would come up with this idea. And of course, as we move from the show and tell to the autonomous everything, the nature of the analysis changes. So on the top, a lot of this is done with pretty limited data, fairly straightforward to do, reasonably simple to interpret for humans, and very often a pretty long time to action. So once I know there's too much traffic in front of that park, putting in a crosswalk, I mean, that's with a city planning process, that's probably a multi-year affair to get to action out of this data. Whereas on the bottom, I wrote some actions within minutes. If you really think autonomous vehicles, we're talking seconds for this to work. So there we have instantaneous action based on the data. And it's really complex data. We merge many, many different data sets. We need really advanced skills to do this. And there are, particularly in AI, there are hidden layers or models that are not interpretable by humans anymore. We don't know why that was the recommendation out of this AI network. So as we move along into more autonomy, things get more complicated. So on a more abstract level, to kind of tie this into research, how does the city learn to make it smart? And usually we talk about learning in organizations as single loop and double loop learning. This is a concept that goes back to the 1970s. And so a simple example would be up here, the city has buses, and these buses are always overcrowded, and we have data on this. and someone in the city says, okay, we have overcrowded buses, we should increase the frequency of this bus route, put more buses out there, have them run more frequently. So that's the decision. And that then closes the loop. New data is produced, and we've just engaged in single loop learning. Data in, decision out. We've learned something about the environment. Hopefully we've improved the environment. Pretty straightforward. What if the new data that now comes back says the buses are still overcrowded? Now the city decision maker might sit there and might say, what's happening? Do we have more ridership because the bus route is more attractive? More people take the bus now? Or are people not taking another route? And so he or she will ask for more data and might come to this conclusion, oh, what's really happening is that people who used to use bus route A are now using bus route B because it's more attractive, and actually ridership in A is going down, whereas B is still overcrowded. And if they use this new insight, they have just learned something about the world. They have adjusted their mental model. They have improved their understanding of the world. And if that then leads to a city process where they say, whenever we make decisions on bus route frequency, we look at overlapping routes, and part of our analysis process is to consider the overlapping routes. We have also changed the structures and decision roles of the city as an organization. And that's how we've historically thought about, this is how organizations get better. They engage in single loop and double loop learning. And a good learning organization works really, really hard to question assumptions, look at alternative interpretations of data in order to get to this double loop learning, because single loop learning only works in non-dynamic environments. It only works when things are static, when the rules of the game don't change much. So that's the whole idea with smart cities, continuous learning to improve things. And there's a lot of potential for good in this. So simply the fact that more decisions are actually based on data and not hunches is a great thing. If we do this right, we should be able to use our existing infrastructure much more efficiently. For example, we could reverse the traffic lanes. And so incoming traffic in the morning, the one lane is added in one direction, and in the evening, the lane direction changes instead of building a new road. This can then lead to environmental sustainability because we make cities livable, and actually city dwellers have a much better CO2 footprint than people on the outside of cities. So that's a good thing. If cities are livable, many people live there, environmental sustainability can go up. We could improve services, kind of like the example I brought with the grandmother picking up her grandchildren, by making them more seamless and more need-based. We can improve the quality of life for all people in the city, but particularly for people who are currently forgotten in a lot of the planning. The idea is to also get to more effective and equitable public safety. If we have all of these different ways of collecting data and interacting with the city, we can think of new forms of citizen engagement. What do we currently do? We do public hearings. Who shows up? Middle-aged white women. So what if we use smartphone data? What if we use other ways of interacting with the public? We could make the city quite a bit more equitable and have more knowledge to make good decisions. And there are many other visions that are related to this idea of smart cities. Okay, so at this point, you might ask, how is this happening? How will this all happen? And for those of you who take classes from us that have taken technology marketing before, this might be a pretty well-known model for you. So where we currently are at is that a gazillion companies work on little pieces of this entire technology stack, all the way from sensor to final decision. And there are big companies and there are small companies, and some only do algorithm development, and some do sensors, and some think about data protocols. So there are hundreds and thousands of companies that are trying to build this continuous learning cycle. And we know as researchers that we are in this early stage where everybody's still busy with product innovation, and this will continue for quite some time until a so-called dominant design emerges. So until we agree for whatever reason, this is how we do this. This is the data exchange protocols. This is what sensors look like. This is how data governance looks, all of these things. And so up to this point, there will be many companies, standards, and product variants until a dominant design emerges. Most will die off, and very likely whatever a city invests in today is something that is outdated, and the company might not even exist anymore in 2, 3, 4 years from now, or even sooner. The other thing we know from research is that if you have a connected technology like smart cities technologies, there is something at play that's called the network effect. And the network effect means that the value of every single unit that's installed actually increases as more people choose to install a unit like this. A good example is a fax machine. If you're the only person on the planet, a fax is a pretty useless device. The value of this one fax machine goes up the more people have a fax machine. And so when people rolled out social networks, what did they do? They got you to sign up, and they enticed you to invite all of your friends. Because the moment all of your friends are on that social network, the value of your being a member is exponentially increased. And if you have a situation like this, which is exactly what's happening in smart cities technology, there's a really strong incentive for companies to very quickly and aggressively try things out and see what sticks. Because all you want is installed base. You want to de facto set a standard by having loads and loads and loads of people and companies and cities use your stuff. So we will very likely not get super mature, super well-conceived technology. It just doesn't make sense in this business model. But we will have a lot of different networked technologies and platforms growing and shrinking and dying off until this dominant design finally emerges. So a little bit, we're still in the Wild West. So you can think of this a little bit as if a natural selection process occurs. So all of those companies, all of those bright minds, technologists, engineers coming up with solutions bring genetic variation, if I was an evolutionary biologist. So they try different forms, different beak forms for a bird, different technology solutions. And then the market pressures, and to some extent also regulation, will let some of these things continue on, and they work, and other things will simply die off, company out of business, technology abandoned. And that happens whenever there are new technologies, and history has told us that it's not necessarily always the most superior technology that actually wins this selection process. There are other reasons why selection happens. So the story about the QWERTY keyboard is a little iffy. So there are people who say this is freely invented, but I'm sure many of you have heard that before, that whatever we use as keyboards today, with how the letters are ordered on that keyboard, was a result of a manufacturing problem over 100 years ago. People were typing too fast and wearing out the typewriters that existed at the time. And to slow them down, they arranged letters in a way that they were a little bit slower. But that became the dominant design. Everybody was trained on this keyboard. Retraining is expensive and awkward and not fun. And so we all bought into the ecosystem, and supposedly we're still typing that way. Even though it was not the best solution, even though it was supposedly actually picked to be a slightly worse solution. There are some debates about how true that story really and truly is, but it's a nice anecdote. Reality certainly is that at the time video cassette recorders hit the market, there were two competing systems, VHS and Betamax, and from a purely technical perspective, Betamax was clearly superior, but VHS became the standard. And again, back to this network effect. If you have a VCR or a video recorder, you want movies that you can look at, you want to be able to exchange movies with your friends. You want a blockbusters down the road. So you're buying into an ecosystem. And ultimately, it doesn't matter if somebody else has a better technology. If the old technology has the better ecosystem, this is what we're sticking with. So we know there's natural selection at work. And we know that in many cases, this selection process doesn't lead to the very best solution. And so the next interesting question then would be, well, what are we governed by? Are we governed by processes that are likely to lead to at least very, very good solutions? Or are we governed by processes that might actually have us end up in pretty suboptimal places? And that, again, is something that biologists actually discuss quite a lot. So in biology, there's a big discussion about, well, what's the guiding principle in evolution? And biologists differentiate between convergence and contingency. And if you believe that natural selection and evolution is fundamentally governed by the process on convergence, then you say, well, it doesn't matter where you start. If you want to swim in the ocean and you start as a mammal, you will get fins. And if you start as a fish, you will get fins, because this is the optimal design for this particular environment. And so this slide simply shows the animals in Australia and animals in Eurasia, and the designs look incredibly similar because they operate in similar environments. The underlying species is completely different. These are marsupials. These are not. So convergence is this very optimistic view. As all of these different technologies compete against each other, people and algorithms will select the best ones for each task. And ultimately, we will all end up with something that is close to the optimum. And it really doesn't matter where we started. We will probably come to something that's quite adequate for the things we want to do in a smart city. There are biologists who say that's not true. Because if we really look into evolution, what is happening there is that whatever species we have today is a result of a whole bunch of random and unreproducible results or decisions or selection mechanisms. So it starts with whatever genetic variation happened. Some little DNA piece was read out differently. That's random. And then things happen like, okay, this one species is suddenly disconnected from the other species because there's this avalanche and they can't mate anymore. And so now you have genetic drift. You have one population here and you have one population here. And then you have some weird disease that takes out an entire, or a meteor, it takes out an entire species and entire generations, and their gene pool is gone. Might have been beautifully adapted to the environment, but it's gone. And so you can also think of, well, maybe that's what could be happening. So maybe we can't be quite that confident that all of these little decisions will add up to smart cities being well adapted to human needs. But they might add up to being something that's okayish at best. An example here is chlorophyll. So from a physics perspective, green colored leaves are not an optimum if you want to produce energy from the sun. You would want something darker. Black would have worked much better. But for whatever reason, black was just not in the gene pool. And so leaves are green. So somewhat suboptimal. And from a biologist's point of view, you also have genetic or evolutionary constraints. So even if pigs were to end up in a competitive environment, in an environment where flying would be a really useful skill, it's just not an option because there are path dependencies in how they have evolved, and they cannot simply add wings. So contingency, where you end up, is the result of an unreproducible series of random events, and you may get stuck. Currently, the smart city discussion is clearly on the side of convergence. So we do not try to regulate much. We do not discuss standards too much, other than that companies, of course, want some standards to be able to have the different pieces fit together. We invest a lot of time in coming up with different product variants, the better algorithm, the nicer data science tool. And we also invest a lot of time in building opportunities for individuals to pick and choose the best. So we have this idea that, well, if you have all these data science at a fingertip, data is in the cloud, data science algorithms are in the cloud, we will all be able to pick whatever the best solution is for us. And this selection, this ongoing selection process will ultimately lead to convergence. That's kind of the leading paradigm right now. So there are some path dependencies in data science. So they are similar to the evolution example I brought. And so one is simply opportunistic data collection. Your cell phone has a minimum of 8 sensors. Number is growing with every generation. And you bought it, you spent 600 or whatever bucks on it, and you voluntarily carry it any place you go. So you're kind of doing a dream job for whoever wants data. But of course, that opportunistically collected data is not because somebody needs exactly this data, because that happens to be possible to collect based on your cell phone. Of course, there are technology and budget constraints. There are discussions around ill-suited and biased data. So I might run an analysis with the best data that's available, but that might not be particularly good data. There is concern around dark data, so data that you've collected at one point, but the way you've stored it, you can't access this in exactly the form that would be ideal for your analysis anymore. The discussions around customs and standards. So maybe your boss always wants to have this reported in this and this format, and even though there are better ways to do it, this is the convention. So this is the data we use to analyze this and this problem. And then particularly in artificial intelligence, there's this issue of catastrophic forgetting. So if once you have trained an artificial intelligence system with a particular data set, it can make wonderful decisions for situations that are similar to what was in that data set. And the moment you get new data, you can't just plug this in, because the artificial intelligence would only use the new data and completely forget the old data. So updating an AI engine is a really tricky problem that a lot of people are working on right now. And so all of that stuff works really well as long as the rules of the games don't change. But if you need to do new things, it starts getting quite a bit tricky. So after all this, I promised that I'm channeling Dickens here and that we talk about the best and worst of times. What could possibly go wrong with smart cities? And I'd like to just point out a lot of the things that are currently being discussed. I'll try to do this more storytelling than an academic to really entice you to think about it more. So the issues of concern are privacy, security, ethics and equity, speed of change, environmental impacts, and the topic of learning. And I'll start with learning. So the more we automate decision-making, put it into data science models, the more we take the human out of the equation. And it's humans who develop new mental models. It's not AI that develops new mental models. AI cannot per se say, oh, maybe more people are using this bus now because it is more convenient. You need a human to at least pose this question to the AI algorithm. And so what we're increasingly doing is we're taking human decision makers out of this equation, which in many cases is wonderful and works really, really well. You don't need humans for everything. But there is a real danger that we're having these shortcuts that prevent organizations from really engaging in double loop learning. And double loop learning is what we need in an environment that changes. And a city, a smart city, will change. That's the very nature of the beast. Another issue is, of course, privacy. When everything can provide data, do we know what data is collected? And do we really have a choice to opt out? Is it realistic to tell people, well, you don't have to participate if you don't like this? Is that even realistic? There are people who say, well, that's not a big problem because if I have something like this installed, I could combine technology like the gunshot technology that I talked about. And so I'm continuously producing video, but I only store the video if an event happens, like my system hears the gunshot. And then I only store the last 10 minutes of video, and everything is immediately deleted. So there are technical solutions to this, but how realistic is this in all contexts? And then what if the purpose of the data collection changes? And I don't know if you've been following this, but there's a big discussion around facial recognition right now, and Portland is considering the strictest ban on facial recognition in the country. And at the same time, there's this startup company that basically scrubbed photos from social media sites and anything that's openly available, and now has facial recognition that is so good that if your friend posted you on Facebook because you were at a party, and maybe your school posted you because you were in the graduation picture, and 2 years later you are in a bar where somebody does something horrible, and the police wants to exclude everybody else in the room and want to identify the people who happen to be in that bar at that time, they can now use this technology to say, okay, you are you. And this is, of course, the end of privacy as we know it. You never agreed to being posted on Facebook. Your friends did it, they tagged you. And you had never, ever any expectation that if you are in a bar and that automatically some person taking a picture would make it possible to identify you. But we have the technology, and so there are considerable concerns around that. Security is an issue. This is a 2003 power outage on the East Coast, which had nothing to do with an adverse attack. It was really just a switching center that went bad. But basically, the entire East Coast was without electricity, and all those people are on the street because the subway doesn't work anymore and the traffic lights don't work anymore. So the more connected a city is, the more vulnerable, of course, it is potentially against data breaches or cyber attacks. And with all the open data we are using, well, what if somebody deliberately wanted to use open data to do something bad? So if I want to know where does a terrorist attack hurt the most, it's not a completely insane idea to say, well, there's all this open data. Where are most people in Portland at a particular time of day? So there are some concerns there. Big concerns around ethics and equity. And so this is a famous experiment in social psychology. It's usually called the trolley dilemma. Who's heard about the trolley dilemma? Yeah, it's super well known. So usually this is a train track, and you get to decide if you want to kill a bunch of workers, or if you want to kill a person, or if you want to throw someone off a bridge to stop the train. MIT did this similar study where the scenario was, okay, this is an autonomous vehicle. It can kill the passengers by driving against a tree. It can kill grandma, or it can kill the baby. And they were interested in how do people make these problematic, horrible moral choices. But they were interested in cultural differences. And so they found that in countries that value the experience of older people and have a lot of respect for older people, people systematically preferred to kill the baby, whereas in Western countries, people always killed grandma and protected the baby, or in most of the cases. And the conclusion of that paper was, well, given those different cultural resolutions to horrible moral dilemmas, maybe we have to program our autonomous vehicles differently in different cultural environments. This to me is not very satisfying and might require a bit more research. Another issue, of course, is that smart city technology is much easier to implement in the new development than retrofitting the old development. So the question, who gets those benefits and how equitable is this, clearly arises. It also provides a certain difference in power. So if you belong to a community that has a lot of data analysts simply because, hey, you're in an well-educated upper middle class neighborhood and you know a data analyst, you can use open city data really well to advocate for your needs. If you're not in a community like this, you can reason with data like these other people do. So how equitable is it really to say, well, everything is open to everybody, just need to go and run with it, if not everybody has the same possibilities to run with it. I already talked about that some data technologies are black boxes to humans, so we don't even know why the decision is made. Another one also frequently discussed is that data on biased practices can actually perpetuate those practices. And you might have heard about this case. So Amazon had an AI recruiting tool that was intended to improve the number of women who make it through the first screening and are actually invited to an interview. And they really, really tried to use this as an equitable tool with this idea that by not having a human decision maker in a mainly male environment decide what is a good recruit, but by having an AI tool, they can fix this problem, and they had to scrap it. Does anyone know what went wrong? Why did the AI, they tried so hard, they're smart people, why did this not work? Yeah.
If memory serves, the AI system was using data to rank candidates, and it was comparing candidates against the existing population of employees. And because that existing population had a certain distribution of male and female, the AI said, "Oh, that's what we want."
Yeah, I
and
think
it tried to replicate
yeah, it was
that.
super similar, but not exactly that. So ultimately, what it did, it looked for indications in reference letters and in reviews and kind of when your boss gives you an evaluation of quality. And so they say, okay, what words are systematically associated with a really good person? So what words do people use? But people use different words to describe women and men. So when a man is described, he may be described as assertive or leading or something like this. And humans simply don't use the same adjectives to describe an equally competent woman. And so because the ingoing data had a bias or had different traditions or different ways to deal with it, the AI that learned from the data just learned the bias and didn't work. And so that's a big concern. Then a lot of the AI, a lot of the smart cities technology is intended to nudge us towards better behavior. And so there's this whole stream in behavioral economics that talks about, well, how do we get people to behave in a particular desired way? And for example, they research stuff like if you allow people to decide what a certain percentage of the taxes they have to pay to what cause they go to, they're more likely to comply and actually declare their taxes and pay their taxes. And these are examples which I love because they're so wonderfully straightforward. So this is, they want to get rid of gum in the city. So what they basically just say is, hey, stick your gum here. Do you like Marmite? People have very strong feelings about this food, so that apparently works. And this is in Tokyo, where they want to move people away from the escalators that are always crowded and say, well, take the stairs. And the way they do this is they say, hey, you burn calorie. So tiny little nudges, which is great. And smart cities would allow us to actually track the data. So you don't have to set up necessarily an experiment, but you can see what nudges in the environment work. But on the other hand, we are producing personalized technology facilitated nudges that influence human behavior at incredible scales. And a few examples for that. This is 2005, when the Pope was elected and people were waiting for the announcement of the new Pope. And underneath is 2013. And so if anybody is doubt that technology changes behavior, I think this picture tells it all. So new technology very often causes people to behave in new ways and nudge them into other directions. And so if you are a user of social networks, this is how many hours you spent in 2012 versus how much time you spent on social networks globally in 2019. This is per day. So from 1.5 hours to almost 2.5 hours in just a few years. What happened there? Well, companies got shockingly better at nudging. So one very simple thing, one line of code, that makes the world of the difference is that if you watch a YouTube video and it suggests the next YouTube video and it automatically starts, you can get people to engage with a platform much, much longer. And we are really nudging now people to scale. And if you think of, well, doctors tell us 30 minutes of exercise every day, and to have a healthy relationship, talk to your spouse really for 40 minutes. I mean, this is a chunk of time that could have real consequences. This is an example for personalized nudging. So this, if you use Netflix, then Netflix will tell you or will suggest what you would want to see. And so these are two advertisements for the same movie, Good Will Hunting. But the user on the left-hand side has watched a bunch of rom-coms, and the user on the right-hand side has watched comedy. And so the algorithm, there's no human involved, the algorithm automatically produces this picture versus this picture and proposes to the left-hand user one version of the Good Will Hunting movie, and to the other user another version of the Good Will Hunting movie. So there's very sophisticated personalized nudging, and when we often have this discussion around the bubbles we live in, that's part of that conversation. Okay, then the question of, well, what's humane design and what is an acceptable rate of change? So cities tend to be, because there's built infrastructure, a lot of the fundamentals don't move quickly. And governments have historically been designed to be slow and deliberate and to think in very, very long terms. And sometimes that annoys us, but if we plan a bridge, we usually, as a government, plan a bridge with this idea, okay, one generation pays for something that 3 generations will use, and as a result of this, we need to give this some thought. If you have all this open data and you see that your kid's school is failing, or that you are experiencing pollution, what is an acceptable rate of change? Probably not a 10-year government improvement process. So you want fast and you want different. On the other hand, given how many difficulties many people have with just staying on top of the current technology, maybe the pace we experience already is in many cases not adjusted to what people can actually cope and handle. And so if your traffic looks different, your wait in the morning than in the evening, how well does this really work for us as humans who have not evolved to have everything change all the time? So there are big and exciting research questions there, how to get this right. And then finally, the issue of environmental impacts. So there is incredible potential for smart cities to improve environmental outcomes. Simply the notion of having livable cities that are more compressed and dense and use resources less is great and fantastic, but there are also a lot of unknowns in this. And so one thing is that there is behavioral change in response to technology. And there is some evidence right now that things like ride-hailing services actually might induce additional demand for traffic. So I used to walk. I used to use the subway. Now ride-hailing is so convenient. Why walk? I'll just get an Uber. That then has no positive environmental impact. That has a pretty bad environmental impact. There's also this interesting behavior that people tend to, if they do one good thing and you have appealed to their doing something good, they often in social psychology experiments are a little more relaxed about doing good things immediately after. And so if you're building technology that basically rewards you for doing the right thing, you earn brownie points for recycling and we score them, or you get rewards for whatever. We might actually be, to some extent, crowding out good, intrinsically motivated behavior. And so we don't know if this is happening to scale, we don't know if this has an impact. We just don't know. And then there's all these issues around, well, if technology changes, if we really have self-driving cars in the future, who knows? One theory is everybody gives up their car, prefers to live in a dense service network, and you can always get the car you prefer. So today I want to have a fancy car because I'm going to the opera, and tomorrow I want a truck because I'm getting something at Walmart, or Home Depot or whatever. So one theory is this ability to have autonomous cars will make private cars irrelevant, and people will use a much bigger mix of transportation options, public transportation, shared rides, and so on. But we don't know. Maybe people say, this is awesome. This thing drives me to work. I can check on email in my 2-hour commute, and I'm done with all of the quiet work by the time I hit the office. I move as far out as humanly possible. We don't know. We really don't know at this point. So the environmental impacts are unknown, and they surely go in both directions. So I don't want to in any way degrade the positive effects that these technologies can have. And then finally, data science is not without an ecological footprint. So if you've been to the gorge and you've seen those big data centers, the reason why Google has the data center and Amazon has the data center in the Columbia Gorge is because there's cheap and abundant and ecologically okay hydropower. And in many places, this hydropower was originally used for smelters and other horrible heavy manufacturing. And as that moved out, now the capacity is freed up for data centers. But training a single AI model can emit as much carbon as 5 cars in their lifetime. And so you probably need a whole bunch of AI models to produce an autonomous vehicle. So I think we are only beginning to understand the impacts of those technologies on the environment. So with all this, I hope to have given you a lot of pointers and ideas for further exploration and to think about, either as researchers or simply as technologists who are engaging in this technology, producing this technology, as engineers who make decisions. And then the answer, if this is the best or the worst of times, is basically your story to write. And I hope you will do that. Thank you.
Time for 5 minutes for questions. Yes.
So where does actual human beings observing and talking to other human beings come in with all this data? I'm worried that some city manager is sitting there looking at data, but he doesn't know the human beings that are actually making that data.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a concern. So we've talked to the smart cities people in the city of Portland, and they're actually aware of that issue. And they are more thinking in terms of, can we leverage data to fill in the blanks of the people who just don't ever talk to us? So I don't think there is necessarily a crowding out from there's data here and now we don't talk to humans anymore. I think the opposite could happen. We may, if we do this right, we may be able to get way more insight and more holistic insight from more different people if we use these technologies right. But you need to want to do that, and you need to think about it in designing the technology. That's a good point. Yeah. Yes.
A comment about evolution. You mentioned convergence and contingency.
Yeah.
And there's also, you also mentioned later, which I think is a third kind of avenue, is the fact that the environment changes.
Yeah.
So the context, if you will, when the context changes, regardless of where you've been evolving to, if your environment is different, your strategy is defunct.
Yeah.
And I think there's that relates to the kind of let's leave it there. Maybe your comments on that evolutionary aspect first.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right. So for biologists, it's always an adaptation to an environment, and if you have a shockingly quick regime change that doesn't give you any time to adjust from an evolutionary perspective, you're doomed. And that's true for convergence and contingency. So they talk about something that they call evolutionary constraint, and they say, okay, that's the constraint you have by being well adapted to this environment. And this may be exactly the thing that wipes you out the moment that that environment changes. Yeah.
And I guess the other issue is China's pace of change
in
the last 30 or 40 years.
Yeah.
Is amazing.
Yeah.
And so when we say to ourselves here in Portland, what's the acceptable rate of change?
Nothing.
It doesn't, it's completely incompatible with what's going on in the rest of the world.
Absolutely. But I do think, and I'm not a sociologist, but I mean, there are people who claim that all this emergence of fairly reductive thinking globally to say, okay, my buddies or my ethnicity or my religion, that might actually be a response of people being super uncomfortable with the rate of change, because at this point it is a global phenomenon. And so there are sociologists, and again, I don't know if they're right, but who claim there may be a connection. We may have hit this point where it's already too fast for too many people to be comfortable and happy. Yeah.
And so I apologize, I missed the beginning of that, but it strikes me that that's a useful analogy in some ways. It can also be a very misleading one.
Mm-hmm.
If you're evolving, I've worked consistently doing evolving technology. It seems like evolution, but it really isn't the same thing in many respects. You're still driving it. You're not playing God exactly.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, I completely agree. So I'm not thinking from the perspective of a single company. This is not evolution. This is planning, and this is new technology cycle and all this. But currently we approach this whole smart city thing as well, that all those companies produce the genetic variation and then let the users cobble together the solution they need from this sensor and this data analysis tool, and that we move in the cloud so that it's easy to use. And I think there is a bit of a, if we think of the individual company and their product platforms as the genetic variation, then what the user is supposed to do is the selective pressure.
Right, but I mean, in a way that I think that's sort of, it's an analogy that sort of leaves a false sense of security for the user. They feel that this thing is naturally evolving, so they have control of it. But in reality, that's a very misleading.
I agree. And that was the point I was trying to make with contingency. So what you end up with may be pretty random and not well adapted. Yeah.
I could add to that there's a difference with evolution. The time scale is very different. I started working with computers and stuff in the late 70s. I've seen there's a book called Sorry for the Explosion of the early PCs. I worked with computer books, which are now obsolete. Things change so fast, and people don't really, like you say, people don't have a chance to, well, you don't control the flow, Apple tried to do it with the Visa computer. That was evolutionary dead end. They came up with the Mac, which really helped, and it became just Apple and Windows in the end, and IBM was lost. It's just been wave after wave of change, and it's just been interesting to watch the stakes get higher, and it's a very complex environment, especially with smart cities, the whole range of what's possible, moving to AI, which is only, as you pointed out, AI is not the traditional, here's what AI is going to do in 100 years. It's more just the absolute logic and learning, which has a lot to go. Also.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we're on totally different timescales in comparison to natural selection or evolution. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
To go back to your initial story about Susan.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting, the technology change that you're talking about was so pervasive that we want to think that our cities are going to change that fast. But cities don't change in the same way because they're human. There are these infrastructure problems. And some of the my skepticism towards the smart cities stuff, some of it is that it's cheating on spending on real hard infrastructure. In America, real hard infrastructure costs a ton of money. Nobody wants to spend it anymore. So by talking about smart cities, we can all delude ourselves to thinking that we're gonna change it, we're gonna make it better, and Susan can go pick up her grandkids without spending any money on infrastructure.
She still needs public transportation and a road that works.
Right.
Yeah.
The big problem with that is smart cities. I mean, there's a couple of different ways of looking at it, and another group doesn't even call it smart cities. But I love the history of it. Powell's bookstore has a parking lot, and you have guys get up in it, it's really tight. That was meant for horse carriages. 100 years ago, which was a huge problem, how to get rid of all the horse manure. But the problem now is everybody wants to have smart city solutions, new technology. They want people to pay for this. They want the government to pay for this. I work for the city. We have to make better choices. And what we do, and I love your idea that we need to be thinking a couple generations out of what we're doing. These sensors are going to be useless in 20 months. You know, so we can't spend all this money when we have real problems to do. So how do we make those choices? And again, I think AI and stuff may have some possibilities.
Yeah, definitely.
So we're into bonus time right now, and what we're going to do is continue the conversation back in the ETM library. It's just about 150 feet over. We do have an upcoming talk next week. Sunil Shenoy from Intel, formerly. He was a high-ranking executive there, having led many projects, real leader and influencer there. He's going to be speaking about managing complex projects. And so he's very well known amongst our Intel friends and colleagues and should be a great speaker. And so I would recommend and invite everyone to join us for that. Please join me in thanking Dr. Yetter for today's talk. And have a good weekend and stay safe and virus-free.
Will this rights be available online anywhere, or?
Yeah, I think I wanted to post them on my website anyway. So yeah, I can totally do this.
Okay.
How do I?
Can you log out? I'm going to be headed down to the room, but if you can also bring the little puck.
Yeah.
Come over, please. But I'll